Sejam todos bem-vindos. Estamos aqui no nosso primeiro dia do nosso seminário, áudio, séries, modo de usar. O meu objetivo aqui, em parceria com o Zico, é impulsionar a criação e a produção de audioséries ou podcasts roteirizados. O Lusa está aqui como nosso parceiro de empreitada, ajudando a gente com esse seminário em particular, e o Frank, obviamente, com toda a experiência dele. Frank, thank you for doing this again.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For being here. It's going to be great help to the Brazilian industry. And now I'm going to let you guys talk and discuss podcasts and audio series.
Muito bom, Thiago. Obrigado. Obrigado todo mundo que está entrando. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Lusa. Thank you, Thiago. So we can start this conversation. We are very thrilled to have you, Frank, here with us. Very proud you accepted this invitation. We are a big fan of your work since X-Files. Well, and let's start this conversation with you. Maybe introducing yourself for everyone. Maybe a brief a resume of what have you been doing in the last years, and then we start with the podcasting.
Sure. So I started my career in Hollywood, I guess it was 27 years ago with the X-Files. That was my first job in Hollywood and in television. And I did that series for 8 years, did 2 X-Files movies, became the president of Chris Carter's company. He was the guy that created the show. Did 3 other series with him in addition to the X-Files. And then I did other series. I did a series with Michael Mann called Robbery Homicide Division, a series called Night Stalker. And then in 2010, I moved to the UK to do a series for the BBC and Cinemax called Hunted. And I ended up staying in the UK with my family, none of whom wanted to go back to Los Angeles, and starting a company called Big Light Productions in 2013. So this is our 10th anniversary this year. And we've had something like 10 series in 10 years, which is a lot.
Wow.
So it's been a very, very busy time. And we've done The Medici on Netflix. We did The Man in the High Castle on Amazon, a number of other series, obviously 8 other series. And then we began doing podcasts for Audible about 2 years ago with a company called Vespucci.
Great. So, well, this is amazing. So, let's start exactly with this the differences between, because you've been creating and developing and writing for broadcast TV, for pay TV, for streaming, and now for podcasts. I know you're a fan of podcasts. So, can you briefly tell us the difference between writing and creating for each of those platforms, and the motivation may be different too?
Well, so yeah, just to answer your questions in reverse order, I am a huge podcast fan and consumer. I think I listen to at least 2 or 3 different podcasts every day. Not all of them scripted. Probably most of them aren't scripted, but I listen to a lot. I listen in the morning when I'm shaving. I listen as I'm going to work, as I'm coming home from work, as I'm cooking in the kitchen. And it's just an incredibly easy way to take in a lot of diverse information without having to be sat in front of a screen, and very stimulating. And we were approached by a company called Vespucci, which what they do is they collect journalism all over the world. And more than just collect journalism, they actually sponsor and pay for journalism. And my first career, I was a reporter. Before I came to Hollywood for 7 years, I was a reporter. So I was really attracted to this idea of turning to journalism to find stories. So we partnered and we began developing podcasts for Audible, which took a while to make that deal. But Audible is a great platform and funded the development and production of these broadcasts we've done. The biggest difference, the most obvious difference, is cost. because obviously television is a massively expensive undertaking. And so therefore the barrier to entry in television is quite high. And it's very, very hard to get a green light on a TV show, and then it's hard to make it and it's hard to keep it going. And podcasts, by contrast, are really inexpensive. But that isn't to say they aren't equally interesting and challenging creatively. They are. And I think that was our thinking, is that this is a very inexpensive way to tell really interesting stories, but let's do it with the same level of ambition and commitment to quality that we have when we tell television stories.
Good, perfect. And do you feel I'll let Luz introduce this team now, but do you think podcasting, and the Radio Man is your first venture into the realm of podcasting? Do you think podcasts can bring big audiences to consume? Do you think this is a big thing?
There's no question. Yeah, there's no question. I mean, like, it's become a huge, huge industry, and especially in the United States, but certainly here in the UK is where I'm speaking to you now as well. Many, many people have rushed into this industry because it is cheaper to produce and because it's also very easy to consume. Many, many people are in their cars every day, driving to work. And so the podcasts, the sweet spot tends to be 30 minutes or less, because many people in their daily commute can listen to a complete episode then if at that length. But it's a giant industry now with hundreds of millions of listeners for successful podcasts, and quite profitable as well, because it's not expensive to make, and yet you can reach a massive audience. The cost of distribution is quite low. You don't need to have a broadcast channel distributing your show, and the diversity of programming is limitless as well. So I think it's really, really exciting. And I also think if you are somebody early in your career trying to get established, here's a chance to practice your craft. You're not going to get paid for it as well as you would if you're writing television or movies, but you'll still get paid for it, and you will reach an audience.
Yeah.
And I look back on my early days on the X-Files, and one of the great gifts of that show was that we did 24 episodes a year. 24 episodes a year, right? Like the soaps and the telenovelas do that kind of volume, but it's very rare to have that opportunity to flex your storytelling muscles and grow. And so I think podcasting, because it's less expensive, gives you the chance to work and to work a lot. And it can, if you have the same level of ambition as you would in some other medium, it's going to be as rewarding for you creatively. And I think the other sort of unspoken agenda for a lot of people in doing podcasts, and certainly ours with Radio Man, is if you work out the story and the kinks in the development of the podcast, it serves as then IP, intellectual property, that can be then used potentially to make a television series or a movie.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen this happen before. Luza.
Yeah, Frank, nice talking to you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to share your thoughts, your understanding of podcasting with us. Fiction, scripted fiction podcast is still, at least here in Brazil, struggling. But it seems for us, from our standpoint, that in Europe and the US, it's kind of booming. How long did it take to hook the audience in comparison to unscripted podcasting? Like, talk shows and even true crime stories, which is a trend here in Brazil too.
So it's a really good question. We've actually done 2 unscripted podcasts as well. We did one called Killer Book Club that came out a year before Radio Man, and we have one coming out next month called Patient Zero. But we are on the Audible platform, which is a paid platform. And so in one sense, it's quite easy in terms of distribution, because we just drop on Audible and all the subscribers to Audible automatically have access to our podcast and it's promoted very well on that platform. The one downside for us as producers is we have no idea how many people we're reaching. They like, they don't tell you.
They don't share with you the information?
No, you don't know.
Bloody bastards.
They tell you they're pleased, and they want you to do more. But it's kind of, the same problem we have, honestly, in the streaming world with television as well, is that you can't really gauge your success because it's commercial information they keep to themselves.
The only thing that you know that you are doing well is, let's do a second season. That's the only thing. Only on that you understand that you achieved success. Is that correct?
Exactly. So Radio Man, as you know, is a limited series. There is no way you could really bring that narrative back. But yes, if we did a series that had the potential to continue, then being asked back would be a good sign. But I mean, Audible does want us to keep making more podcasts, so we must be doing something right.
But true crime is still, it is indeed a big thing in US and Europe also, like it is happening here in Brazil.
Absolutely true. I mean, true crime and television is at the moment one of the most popular genres. There's a huge hunger to find true crime stories that can work. So interestingly, Radio Man is inspired by a true crime. This really did
It
happen.
is a book, right? It is a book.
But we changed it quite substantially because we knew we had Nikolai Coster-Waldau, and we knew we were going to be making it for Audible UK. So we relocated the story to the UK and developed it to make it more twisty and turny than the actual narrative was.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just speaking of Radio Man, and the main character is a podcaster himself.
We talked about a lot.
Yeah, this meta language. Do you think this is a sign of maturing in the podcast realm when in a fiction series you use a podcaster as a main character?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right. I mean, without spoiling the story for you, I don't know if any of you ever saw the old Billy Wilder movie called Ace in the Hole about Kirk Douglas.
Yeah,
he's a washed up newspaper reporter in a small town where there's a mine disaster, and he milks the story to try and get his journalism career back. And to me, it had a lot in common with Ace in the Hole, except that, as you say, it's podcasting, which seems to be the medium of the moment, more so than newspapers.
Great, good. It's a medium of the moment. That's why we're here.
Yes.
Yeah, that's why we are here. I believe there's a lot of writers listen to you, Frank. So it is a good opportunity to discuss a new place where we can work. But you mentioned a very important thing. It's a good way to start your portfolio. It's a good way to show that you can handle characters, that you can handle a story in 20 minutes or in 30 minutes and in 40 minutes. It's a good way to show that you can understand how the story should be divided in episodes. So, I mean, you're speaking music to us because we want to, generally speaking, we want to try new markets, and podcasting seems to be really booming. That's at least our hope. It is booming in US, in England too, right?
Definitely. And I would say, if you're intrigued to do this, don't condescend to the medium. Don't say, well, this is just a podcast. Treat it with as much serious and gravity and commitment as you would anything else, and you will get the rewards from doing it. I didn't write Radio Man. A wonderful writer named Joe Derrick, who has worked with Nikolai for many years and has partnered with him, in fact, wrote it and did a brilliant job. But I would say that I learned a lot doing this because, as you all know, it's sort of an obvious thing to say, but television and cinema are visual medium, and podcasting is audio. And we hired this amazing sound designer producer who goes by the name Ben Brick, who's Peabody Award winning for other podcasts that he's done. And the way he used sound to paint a picture and the detail of his sound and the voices or the atmosphere in the room was so evocative and powerful. And it's a completely different storytelling palette that I'm accustomed to using in television and film. Of course, we use audio as well as a component, but here you're using audio to conjure an image in your mind's eye. And that's an interesting thing also about podcasting as opposed to visual storytelling. You know, when we did X-Files, especially in the early seasons, we often didn't have the money to show scary things. And so we relied on the dark and your imagination. And you know, that's kind of a wonderful thing that we sometimes forget now in this era of hyper budgets for television and film, is leaving space for you as the audience, as the viewer or the listener, to imagine for yourself, to complete the picture that's being suggested to you by the storyteller. And that's one thing that podcasts do naturally more than film or television that is very, very powerful. It's more akin to reading a book, because obviously when you read a text, you're inventing all of it in your mind's eye. And podcasting is kind of that middle ground where you're hearing voices and you're hearing the atmosphere of the scene, but you're being asked as a listener to imagine the rest of it in your own head. And I always think, you know, audiences love you for that. If you will give them the space to participate in the storytelling by using their imagination, not just having everything spelled out for them.
Yeah, that's what we have discussed, right, Luza?
It was at the top of my tongue. We've been discussing podcasting, me and Zico and Thiago, for some time now, in lunch, having a beer. And Zico came up with this phrase, which I think is perfect for address exactly what you said. In podcasting, the listener is co-author of the story, co-creator of the story, because it needs to help the writer with his imagination. Is that correct? Did I quote you right, Zico? Is that the phrase?
Yeah, it wasn't my phrase actually, but this is something that I feel for a long time. I think it was Isidoro, which is another podcast producer, who says that the audience is the co-producer of a book or of a podcast in this sense, because everyone makes an image in their head different, that's the richness of this mean, isn't it?
Yeah, and that was one of the things I was amazed that Ben Brick did so well, is that you could sort of cut, you know, to another scene, but because of the audio texture, it was very clear where you were. It was really masterful of creating that kind of cinematic sense of, you know, being outdoors or being in a cafe or being in, you know, somebody's home. And it also, I think, while this is not to say that podcast producers aren't risk averse, everybody wants success. But I do think because of the medium, there is more opportunity for experimentation and for taking chances in narrative strategy, which I think the Radio Man does in terms of point of view. So, you know, for all those reasons, I think it's a really great, exciting medium for storytelling.
Absolutely. And do you think there's a kind of a theme or kind of stories that are more suitable for podcasting rather than film or series? Like you said that you can take more risks doing podcasts. You can be even more graphic. You can, you know, go to the moon and back in 2 seconds. How can we approach the kind of stories that the podcast medium makes us do?
That's such an interesting question. I think it's a good point that the genres that are available to you in podcasts are really endless. You could really tell anything, and you know, and really podcasts are basically the radio shows of decades ago. You know, before television, you know, radio drama was where, you know, many of the great writers worked, and I'm reminded of, Orson Welles doing War of the Worlds,
the world in the
and
radio.
creating a panic, in New Jersey. Allegedly, people were killing themselves, believing, Martians had really landed. And that was science fiction of an epic scale, but being suggested, simply through audio. And so I think, the movie business has got itself in kind of a trap right now, certainly in Hollywood, where all the films have to be these mega expensive blockbusters with incredible visual effects budgets to create this kind of event that draws you into the cinemas. But really, you could do the same thing for a fraction of the cost in a podcast. And I can't think of, I think crime genres are clearly the most popular, but I can't think of a genre you couldn't do successfully in a podcast.
Good to know. Science fiction, especially, we've been listening to a lot of science fiction in scripted podcasts lately, especially in the US.
Well, that's the other thing. It's like if you want to sell a science fiction show on television, it's very hard with an original idea. It's very hard to get anybody to buy an original piece and make it into a television series or a movie. They're always asking for IP. Right. Well, if you make a podcast of it, first of all, you're making it. You are telling the story and reaching an audience immediately. You're doing it for a fraction of the cost of a television show or a film. And you're then creating the IP that is demonstrated to work, and that could then be adapted into a television series or a movie.
Yeah.
So there's all these reasons why it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, good. So you talked about the opportunity for new writers and creators to start with the podcast and flexing their muscles, maybe. But do you see also a opportunity for actors who can break free from the limits of age and physics, appearance? So you can you give more opportunity to actors who are not cast in because they are older or wherever in audiovisual.
100%. And I heard this amazing interview with a woman whose name I don't recall on a New Yorker Radio Hour podcast a few weeks ago, who is an African American woman in her 50s and has done hundreds of audiobooks. And her voice is her instrument, and she's a chameleon and has played all sorts of parts because it's audio and not visual. She doesn't matter what she looks like. And I think, that's one of the great things about the UK culture is that the actors here have always gone seamlessly from film to television to stage to radio. There's never been barriers between the different media. And I think, it's not terribly time consuming for an actor to do a podcast. You can do it in a matter of days, whereas to do the same thing on television or film would take you months. So it's an opportunity to do more, with the time you have. And again, as I say, if you treat it with the same seriousness and level of ambition that you treat the other things you might do, it's equally rewarding.
Great to know.
Creatively.
Sure. Luza, let's talk about the creative process, maybe.
Yeah, I have a question regard to the conception of podcasting. Listening to Radio Man, I kind of sense that there is some graphic language, not a graphic imagery, because it's constructed on the brain. We have a strangulation very well detailed at the end of first episode. In Batman, at the beginning of the pilot, there is an autopsy described with details. Do you think that podcast has, or it is a best scenario for break free from some care in order to share graphic language? Do you think it's more acceptable in podcasting?
I absolutely do. And I have to say, Radio Man is my first scripted podcast, and it was a huge learning experience for me, just as the producer, because as I say, Joe Derrick wrote and directed the podcast, and then Ben Brick did the sound design and produced it with us. And it was a collaboration between Joe and Ben Brick, but I didn't appreciate it until I heard Ben Brick's work.
You didn't like it, the idea of showing strangulation at the end, for instance.
Yeah, I didn't understand what you could do with sound. I didn't realize how evocative these brushstrokes of sound could be, and how much storytelling could happen between the voices, and how much it prompts you to close your eyes and see the world that's being suggested just in audio, and the potency of that. So I think now, having had this first experience with Radio Man, I certainly will look at the next one much more with audio design much more at the front of my mind. And I'll tell you what it reminded me of. I don't know if all of you are familiar with the movies of David Lynch, but David Lynch in movies like Eraserhead and Blue Velvet and Elephant Man, he used non-traditional and surprising sound. He had this amazing sound designer named Alan Splett to just evoke like visceral feelings in the audience that were non-literal. And I think that was part of a revolution in movie sound design, but I think it's equally happening in podcasts, which is really exciting.
Another question. Sorry if I jumped into another question. How was the process of creating and writing Radio Man? Is it similar to what we do when we create a TV series? Is there a difference? And most important, how did Frank, who was the guy from TV, how you fit in this process? I mean, new learnings, things that you didn't like, and like the graphic imagery. How was the process? How did you fit into it?
Well, I think in my case, Vespucci came to me because they had never done scripted drama before, and they wanted somebody who had credibility in that space to then go to Audible and propose that they, fund a slate of podcasts. And so we partnered, and Vespucci has literally, hundreds, if not thousands of stories from across the world. And we looked at stories, and we picked this true story that Radio Man is based on as something that we wanted to do as a podcast. And then we were able to interest Joe Derrick and Nikolai Coster-Waldau to make it with us. And then we talked a lot with Joe. I mean, unlike most television series that I do, which are usually collaborations, I'm very much involved in the writer's room process, where there's a single writer or writing team who writes the first episode of a TV series, and then you bring in other writers that you collaborate with on subsequent episodes. But in this instance, it was Joe who wrote all the episodes himself. So my fellow producer, Emily Feller, and I spent a lot of time talking to Joe about how to adapt this story and what it would mean, what the themes were, and the characters, and how the mystery of it would unfold. And then Joe, wrote all the scripts, and we went through the normal kind of development process of giving him notes on the scripts. And then we cast the voices just like you would cast, a television show. But then, as I say, the one part of it that was completely new and deeply surprising to me was the role of the sound designer. Because in television, of course, you have a director and a production designer and a costume designer and a cinematographer. And really, in this instance, all of those departments were the sound designer. And, it's a trade-off, but, in some ways it's as powerful as visual storytelling, because it relies on your imagination. it's less explicit, but in some ways more evocative than visual image.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Luza,
say.
yeah, no. Should we enter more in the creative process, or how much do you get involved, Frank, in the whole thing, in casting? How do you choose the right voices? We have the sense here in Brazil that maybe actors who are good on television, maybe they are not so good in audio. Is that true, that maybe an actor using only his voice, it has to be a better actor than the one who's actually using the images or prompting of the images? How do you see that, the casting process?
Well, it's an interesting question because we did have some brilliant film and television actors. Nikolai, I've already talked about, David Morrissey, Kathy Tyson. These are people who are very successful in film and television, who are doing radio, and of course there was no difficulty at all for them going to this medium. But as you were pointing out before, it liberates you because it is voice. You don't need people to look like the characters they're playing. And there is something when you're only listening to somebody's voice, there are qualities it suggests that are quite different than when you're looking at their face and their appearance as well. But in terms of the casting process, it was kind of the same kind of casting process you'd get if you were doing television or film, except we were listening to voices instead of looking at faces. And I wasn't the hands-on day-to-day producer of Radio Man. That really fell to Emily Feller and to Joe Derrick and to Ben Brick. But it's a very similar process. It happens a lot faster. And if you have cast the wrong person, it's much easier to make a change. But the whole process,
did it happen in
there was one voice that didn't work out and that we changed. But the whole process of recording the show took less than 2 weeks.
Wow, and that's amazing. Yeah, 2 weeks for the production itself.
Yes, and then the post-production was a couple months. So it's lightning fast compared to television, which is also really fun. It's fun to go faster.
Yes,
I mean, most of that time was Ben Brick and fell on his shoulders squarely. Most of that time was the sound design part of the process. But otherwise, it follows a kind of a familiar pattern if you've done television or film production.
Good.
Frank, let's talk about the experience of listening to podcasts. For instance, me, Luza, I like to listen to podcasts, lay down on my bed, preferably with the room dark. Zico prefers to listen to podcasts cycling, and Thiago prefers to listen running. Do you think that this difference, the level of experiencing the podcast, is it something that you think when you produce or writing a podcast?
I don't when I'm producing or writing, because it's kind of beyond my control how my audience is going to consume whatever story I have chosen to tell. But I know for me as a listener, when I'm listening to nonfiction podcasts, when I'm listening to news or interviews, I'm absolutely fine if I'm cooking or walking but if I'm listening to fiction or scripted drama, I don't want to be distracted. Like you, I think I want to be sat down or lying down. I want to be in a place where my mind is not going to wander, because to me, fiction, narrative storytelling kind of casts a spell, and you can't go in and out. You need to be focused, or you lose something really valuable in the experience. So yeah, I tend to be much more focused when I'm listening to something like Radio Man than I would be if I was listening to an interview of some kind.
Good. I like listening, cycling, or even walking. And I was listening to Radio Man the other day walking, and the audio design is so perfect that there's this woman shouting at policemen during the story, and you can hear her only on your right ear.
Yes.
And I was walking, and I thought that someone was calling me on the other side of
Behind you. Yeah. That happened to me too.
It happens.
Yeah.
Or even I was cycling the other day, and there was a shot in the story, and I thought the shot was there in the park. I was, wow, and no, it's the podcast. So I think this experience is so immersive somehow.
Yes.
More than even in the audio visual, because you were there, like if you were inside the story, right?
That's absolutely right. I think that speaks to what we've been talking about how audio pulls you into the narrative in a way that television and film don't. You know, if you're watching it on TV or film, that you're not going to have that instinct to look, because you can see it visually, but somehow it tricks your mind.
It does.
And you feel you're present and in the story. And that's really exciting. I mean, you know, I always say it's like people who do what we do, you do it because you love storytelling, right? And any opportunity to tell good stories is a great opportunity. And I think honestly, the problem for somebody like me is, if I have limited time and resources, am I going to spend that time on a giant TV series or on a podcast that financially doesn't offer anything like the same kind of reward?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, the ideal world is one where I can do both, because they both offer creative rewards, and that's what kind of feeds your soul as a storyteller, is that kind of satisfaction of knowing that you set out to tell a story and you did.
Great, that's a nice feeling.
Absolutely.
Curiosity. Frank, do you know when an idea is best suited for podcast or film? Let's suppose I'm pitching an idea for you, and I'm pitching this idea for a TV series. Do you know, do you realize, can you notice that this idea is not best suited for TV series, but is better for podcasting? Is there something like that?
The honest answer is, at least to me as a storyteller, just about every idea could work in either medium. It's about where you can get it produced. And look, it's not that it's easy to get a podcast greenlit. It's not. And, we've had several things with Audible that have not gone, right? That did not fit their understanding of what their audience wants to listen to. So the audience answer, the honest answer is, it goes where you can sell it. It goes where you can find a buyer who's willing to fund and distribute the story you want to tell. And I think the exciting thing about podcasts is it's a much wider world in terms of opportunity. And it's a much lower bar to entry than there is in television. And so that, to me, is why, especially if you aren't fully occupied in television, if you have some free time on your hands, or if you are starting out in your career and looking for opportunities, it's like, this is another opportunity. And I think even with the current retrenchment in the streaming television world, even with that, this is still the best time ever to be a storyteller. There have never been more opportunities in more genres. There's never been wider reach. And, in television storytelling, you can now reach the entire world, which wasn't possible before. And if you're doing, podcasts in Portuguese, you're not going to reach, the non-Portuguese speaking world, but there are no borders. You're going to reach the rest of the Portuguese speaking world all over the planet with your podcast. So I think that's all really exciting.
Yeah, you mentioned this, and it makes me think that a Portuguese spoken podcast can't travel much, just within the Portuguese speaking community, because there's no subtitles. So this is or no dubbing for that matter. But still, how do you feel? How do you see? Because in Brazil, as Luza was saying, scripted podcast is struggling. Most of the fiction or scripted podcasts, they are adaptation of a foreign podcast, like Batman, that have been produced here, like Sandra, the Patient 63, which is now being produced. It's a Chilean idea, produced in Chile and then Brazil, and now in the US with Julianne Moore in one of the casting. So how do you see that adapting stories from original podcasts in different languages, and also adapting stories that came from books or from movies, or even from a 100% full-length audiovisual series? How do you see this adaptation?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with taking something that worked well in another medium or another culture and adapting it. But to me, the most exciting thing is to use this medium to do something that nobody else has done. And if scripted podcasting hasn't really caught on in Brazil yet, it tells me nobody has made that scripted podcast that makes people see how exciting this medium can be. And I think if it were me, if you said to me, Frank, you've got to make a podcast, scripted podcast in Brazil, I'd be looking to do something that nobody could do on television or film. To do a story that could only be done in audio, something that's so expensive or so shocking or so unconventional, and that would get people's attention and make them fall in love with this approach to storytelling, like I've fallen in love with it, because I know that the potential is there. I know the potential is there. It's just it hasn't been tapped into yet, and I hope somebody listening to us on this Zoom call today will be the one who comes up with that idea.
Yeah,
that's the story they love that they couldn't tell otherwise.
Yeah, that's the main goal of this. One of the main goals of this conversation, to foster the scripted podcast industry, which is really just beginning, or even hasn't begun yet.
Well, the thing I just want to keep repeating, and I'm sorry, that's probably the third or fourth time I said this, is have ambition.
Yeah.
Really, really aim high. Don't condescend to this because it's a radio drama. And we didn't do that at all. Like, we got Nikolai Coster-Waldau from Game of Thrones. He's a great, great actor. We aimed as high as we possibly could and worked as hard as we could to really make this something that was, worth people's time, and that would be, consumed, months and years after it was originally distributed. And I just find again and again in my career, the higher you aim, first of all, you're never going to hit the target you aim for. Everything I do, whether it's TV or movie or radio, I'm aiming so high, the best thing ever. I really am. And you never get there, but you might get here. It might be pretty good. But if you don't aim really high, if you aim it pretty good, well, guess where you're going to land?
Yeah.
You're not going to land. It's not going to be great, and there's no point in doing that. So aim as high as you can and really embrace this opportunity and bring all your passion for storytelling to it, and then you will be rewarded. And I really do think it's true. There's a cliche: no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. Right? if you love this podcast, if you were moved by it, then there's a chance other people will be too. But there's certainly no chance if you aren't. So it needs that kind of motivation and excitement and dedication to elevate the medium and to help it reach the audience it deserves, because it does deserve a wide audience.
Ambition is a very good word, and it seems to me that this word is used when producing Radio Man 2, because it's not flat. We talked about it, Frank. It's not flat. It has different dimensions. You can perceive people in different places of a room talking. You can notice on the ear. And it's a very good achievement for audio series. And that's something that we have our ambitions to. We're aiming here in Brazil. Can you detail a little bit? You said that it took some months to post-product it. Can you detail a little bit how was the process of drawing just different levels of voices? Because it's, I mean, I listened to Radio Man last week, but I'm used to podcasts. And this one is really a worldwide benchmark in terms of sound design.
Oh, thank you.
A little bit first, in order to raise the bar for all of us here in Brazil.
Well, I would love to take credit, and I wish I could, but I really can't. So this is another difference with the podcasting world versus film and television. You know, whenever I do a TV series or when I've done movies, I am all over the production design and the costume design and the sound mix and the audio mix and all that stuff. With a podcast, it really is in the hands of the auteur, in this case, Ben Brick. And, you know, he was working by himself. And he created many of the sounds or original sounds that he went out and he created himself. He went out and found ways of making these sounds and creating this atmosphere and recording these voices. And it was really a one-man show. And so it was really just left to me and to Emily, my fellow producer, to react to his work and to give him notes. And honestly, there were very few. He just happens to be one of the best people in the world at doing this. And again, that's where I speak to our level of ambition. It's like we wanted the greatest sound designer we could find for this podcast, and we were fortunate enough to find him. And so in that sense, I would say for us anyway, in this instance, it was less collaborative than we normally are in television and film. And more just letting this genius do his work and not get in his way.
Okay, so he's more than a showrunner. He makes the whole thing like one man.
He really had it in his head, and he's a music composer as well as a guy who does sound design on podcasts. But he takes it very, very seriously, as you can see by listening to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Congratulations for him too. And one thing that struck me is you have been attracted to the podcast world because you were a podcast consumer and the storyteller. And we can see that, especially in the US, and it's happening in Brazil a little. It's attracting actors, Hollywood actors, or celebrities, or like Nikolai or Ethan Hawke or Julianne Moore. How do you see that? Again, the podcast is an opportunity for those big celebrities to do something that people might think, well, this is smaller than Game of Thrones for Nikolai, for instance.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's an interesting difference between European culture, and American culture, because the American market tends to be ruthlessly commercial. It's just all about money and audience, right? And so it tends to be that American talent is drawn to things that are going to be very, very profitable and advance their careers. And, it's very business-like.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here in the UK and in Europe, it's commercial to a degree, but it's kind of not. And there's always been much more willingness to engage with things that are not particularly profitable, but that are interesting creatively and that are good work, and that they're going to, be proud to have been part of. Just the thrill of making something, of creativity, which is one of the things that I've really enjoyed, having been an expatriate, now for 13 years. I've lived outside of America for 13 years now, in the UK and in France. I've really liked that, and it's changing. I think the streaming services coming across the Atlantic to Europe have kind of made it a bit more commercial than it used to be, but it's still is pretty much that way. And so like a lot of those names you're listing, like Julianne Moore, they have that, they're British, or they have that European influence. But I do think it's becoming increasingly accepted for actors to participate in podcasts. And then a lot of them are producers now.
Mm-hmm.
And so you will see, Reese Witherspoon's company, making podcasts because they recognize the commercial potential of them. So, to me, there's every reason to do it if you have the time to do it, because it's rewarding creatively. That's the most important thing. And then on a secondary level, there is a great commercial aftermarket for a successful podcast. Potentially, it can be the laboratory for the TV show or the film that you subsequently make from it. That's a secondary benefit. It's not the reason to do it. I would never just do it, to be a prototype for something else. It needs to have value and integrity.
Yeah, a value per se, right? Yeah.
But there's no ignoring the fact that it also has that potential.
Yeah, to bring attention to that. Great, Luza. Do you have any more questions? Because I think it's about time we open.
Yeah,
for
I don't have I have a lot of questions, but I mean, some of those questions should be addressed on the bar table. But I mean, there's a lot of people with questions here. I mean, things that I can't even imagine to ask Frank. Maybe it's time to pull them in.
Yeah. So Thiago is back.
I'm back. So Frank, we have a lot of questions, but I don't know if we'll have time to cover them all. My first question, the first question is, do you think that any project can be adapted to a podcast series? Like if you have acquired the rights for a book, or if you have a film project or a TV project, and you can sell it as it is, do you think that it can be adapted for a podcast series?
So the answer is creatively, yes. I see no reason. I can't think of a genre that wouldn't translate to this medium. The commercial question is a different one, because even though they don't cost nearly as much as film and television, they still do cost something. And so you're going to need to fund this podcast, and you're going to need to find somebody to distribute it, unless you're just going to put it up yourself, on the internet. So that's where it becomes trickier. You need the conversation with buyers about what they're looking for and what sells. And, if you can get talent attached to it, that always helps. And that's part of why, we went to Nikolai for Radio Man. And, the trends in podcasts are kind of the same as the trends in television right now, which it tends to be the most popular genre is crime, murder, mystery, thriller. Those tend to be the most popular and the easiest to sell. But that doesn't mean you can't do science fiction or fantasy or supernatural or, anything you can think of. I think that they're all available to you if you can find the buyer.
Perfect. I know that Joe was the one who wrote the scripts for Radio Man, but can you tell us a little bit more about the differences about developing a script for a TV series and for a podcast series? I mean, even for formatting the document.
Well, it actually the script itself looked a lot like a TV script, except that instead of he didn't describe the way anything looked, and he wasn't, often when you're writing a TV script, it's about suggesting the visuals, and there was no attempt to suggest the visuals. There were suggestions about what you were hearing. So, and often the scenes were simply where you were, and leaving it to the sound designer to imagine how to convey the atmosphere of where you were. But if you've heard the podcast, his daughter India, Chaz's daughter India, is a big character in the show. And I think structurally, if this had been a TV series, that would have been a much more challenging proposition, adding this layer of the daughter, and the daughter, I don't want to spoil the story, but the role she plays later in the show. And so that was one thing where I think we felt, because it was a podcast, we were willing to take that narrative. It would have been a much harder sell if it had been a television series. But having said that, the podcast has been very successful and very well received and well reviewed, and so it is something that I think hopefully may well become a television series at some point in the future.
Okay. You've mentioned the sound designer. He was the main person for the project. During the process of the sound design, was the writer working with him, like adapting dialogue or action to make it better?
Not to my knowledge. I think Benbrick was talking to Joe about what he was doing because Joe was the director.
Yeah.
But so that I think there was a free flow of conversation and ideas. But as far as I know anyway, and I haven't really interrogated Joe about this, it was really left to Benbrick to imagine the sound and the design. And Joe, like us, this was his first time in the podcast world. Joe's an accomplished film and television writer, but he had never done a scripted podcast before this. So I think to some degree we were all learning from Benbrick, because he was the veteran and we were all the newcomers to this medium.
Perfect. Can you share with us a little more details of how you put together the budget for the project, and how much time did it take from greenlighting the project to the final product to Audible?
Boy, it actually took a long time for reasons I don't fully understand. But when we finally got the green light from Audible, which was a lengthy process, I think it took about I'd say 6 to 8 months for Joe to deliver the finished scripts, and that process was the same as it would have been if we were doing a television series, where he delivered drafts and we gave notes and he did the rewrites and so on. And then we did the casting, which came together very quickly. We recorded the whole thing, as I said, in less than 2 weeks. And then it was about 2 months of post-production with Benbrick before we delivered to Audible, who honestly had very few notes on the mix. So it was once the green light happened, the hardest part by far was the writing of the scripts, and then the recording and the post-production went very smoothly.
Okay. Let me check the next question. Do you have any tips for producers and writers, or where they can learn more about writing scripts for podcasts or putting together budgets? Lusa, yes.
Yeah, in addition to that, we have here in Brazil a little bit of difficulty in order to get podcast scripts. Is there a place, a hub, where we can go there and study some examples of writing in podcasting?
I don't know the answer to that. We just made it up. I mean, we didn't have any model at all. I will ask Joe Derrick if I can share his scripts with you, and if I can, I'll send them to you.
That would be great.
After this, so you can see the way he wrote his. In terms of the budget, Audible gave us a budget, and so this is how much you have to spend, and then we.
So it was like, you have this amount of money, do wherever you can.
Yeah, but I mean, but they, they make lots and lots of podcasts, and very high-end podcasts at Audible, and they're kind of, I think, among the industry leaders. So yeah, they're very they know what they're doing, and they were able to help us in terms of production facility and technical support.
And I think this is a question for many producers here. Why did you decide to invest in a podcast? Like, Audible gave you the money to do this, and you have a lot of projects in your production company. Why did you decide to invest in podcasting?
I really did it because I love podcasts, and I just wanted to do it. It honestly, it is a challenge because I have a limited time and limited staff, And all things being equal, from as a small business owner, right? I run my company in London. I'm going to get a lot less financial return out of investing my time on a podcast than investing it in a television series. So I have to be careful how many hours I devote to something like this, because it isn't nearly as much of an upside as there would be on television. But I do love doing it, and that's kind of why I did it. And in the instance of Radio Man, anyway, Nikolai's involvement means that this is something that could translate, as I was saying, sometimes these podcasts can, into a television or film adaptation later on. So I suppose that was at the back of my mind in this instance. But as I said, we did 2 non-scripted podcasts as well that had very, very little chance of ever, seeing the light of day in another medium. But we just did it out of the love of telling a great story.
Perfect. What are the skills and abilities that you think that a writer should have to write an audio drama?
Well, I think they're kind of the same things that are involved when you're telling a story for television. I don't think you have to know why you're telling the story. I don't think you have to know consciously what the theme is, but it certainly helps if you understand why you're telling it. And I know Joe had very clear ideas about why he wanted to tell this story about Radio Man, about community, and about family, that he wanted to express in the world we're living in now. And I think he conveyed a lot of those without being didactic in Radio Man. But then it's like any great drama, it's about great characters, and in this case a mystery that hopefully you can't predict the ending too far in advance, and twists and turns, and making the audience want to stay, and that is something that I think that podcasts have in common with streaming platforms, is they measure success by how many episodes did the viewer consume. Did they listen to all the episodes, or did they stop listening after 2 or 3? So you need to construct a story that kind of has cliffhangers in it, that makes the listener want to come back and listen to the next episode and the next, and so on. So it's very, very similar in terms of the storytelling values between podcast, television, and cinema, I think.
There's another tricky question here. Someone's saying that all the streaming platforms, they usually take the IP away from you. Do you have any tips on how you can develop a podcast without them?
Well,
first of all, get a good lawyer, and then.
Well, this is where the fact that podcasts don't pay you a lot of money works in your favor, because they need to incentivize you to do this, right? So in our case, I think I can say this, we had to give Amazon the first right to make this as a TV series. That was the deal we made. And then if they don't make it, we could sell it anywhere in the world, right? So that's not a bad deal. But yeah, that's part of the negotiation with whoever you make it with, is, look, you want us to make this for you, well, there has to be a reward for us beyond what you're paying us.
Perfect. Do you believe that audio series can be a success among children?
Oh, for sure. I think in some ways, children are the perfect audience for audio series. And even before there was such a thing as podcasts, when my children are small, we used to listen to audiobooks. We used to listen to, I think it was Stephen Fry reading the Harry Potter books, at night. So, bedtime is an amazing time for children to sit. And children, they're so wide open as people. Their imaginations are wide open, and they're the perfect audience for a scripted podcast. I mean, even a better audience than for adults. I think that's an absolutely brilliant audience for scripted podcasts.
Um, Also, do you think that podcasts can help individuals with dyslexia and visual impairment and empower them in any way?
Yes, for sure. I mean, there's no barrier, is there? I mean, there's no text in the way whatsoever, and there's nothing if you have visual impairment, obviously that's not an issue either. So that's another liberating aspect of podcasts. And look, I just think it's fantastic what's happened. Most of my adult life, radio was a backwater, and nobody listened. I listened. I was always a radio listener, but radio drama was essentially dead. And podcasts have brought it back. This is radio drama for the modern age. And it's bigger and better and more vibrant and diverse than it ever was. And that's saying a lot, because in the first half of the 20th century, radio was the popular medium. And now it's blossoming, and it's very exciting. And I hope Brazil will be part of its rebirth.
I know you work for Audible, and all the budget came from them, but someone's asking, how can you approach brands in order to raise money for your podcast? Do you have any idea?
Well, I think it's about salesmanship, isn't it? And this is the thing. This is the the sausage making part of this business, which is you do have to be a salesman as well as an artist, unfortunately. And you need to figure out a way. And I teach writing, and I tell people, it's actually a good discipline, being forced to be an advocate for your story, being forced to distill your story into a sales format to communicate to the people with the money, whether that's a brand or a broadcaster or distributor, why they should make your story, why they should fund it, why they should sponsor it. And we spend a lot of time here, both in our podcast and our TV series, putting together, visual presentations that, convey not just the substance of our pitch, but the tone, and try to excite people about what the story we want to tell in the way we want to tell it. And, I always say, like, storytellers, we are telling a story to someone. It's not enough for you to tell your story. You need to make sure your story is being received by someone, in the way you want it to be received. Like, is this working for you? Is this moving you the way I mean for it to move you? Is it making you laugh? Is it making you cry? It's not enough for you just to put it out there. You got to make sure that it's working, right? It's a two-way thing. And so when you want to get a brand involved, or a distributor or a sponsor, you need to get them excited about your vision. And that means you need to be very clear on what your vision is, and why you want to tell the story, and why you love it, and why you think other people will love it too. So I would put together a sales presentation, brief, easily digestible, that argues why you creatively are so passionate about the story you want to tell.
Perfect. Someone's asking that if they have an independent podcast, how can they promote it and get it noticed?
It's really, really hard. And that's, that's the challenge, because there's so much out there, so many voices, and you can shout, but nobody's going to hear you, right? Unless you're at a site, or have a distributor that's going to make sure other people listen to your podcast. And even established podcast producers are busy shouting, trying to get your attention for the new podcasts they're trying to put out. So it's really, really challenging. And that's where, it helps if you can go to an established distribution platform or podcast producer and get them to buy into what you're doing, just so you can get more of an audience. You can always do it. Anybody can do it and just put it up there, or put it out on the internet. It just doesn't mean anybody's going to watch it. So that's where I think you do want to go out and into the marketplace and try and get buy-in from somebody. And look, it's not as hard as television, but it's still hard. It's all hard, because all these people want to succeed, and as they should. And so but I don't think that's a bad thing. You know, it's forcing you to up your game and make sure that you have a compelling pitch that people are going to respond to. And that's not a bad thing.
Perfect. Do you feel that the UK was quicker to gravitate towards fiction podcasts in comparison to the US because there were still modern audio dramas being produced by the BBC and other big companies?
So I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think that's the case. You're right that the UK has always had a tradition of excellent radio broadcasting. You know, the BBC is still, despite all the blows the BBC is subjected to, sadly, because I love the BBC, but they have Channel 4, which has always had fantastic programming. But the US, it took off first in the US. And I think it's because the US is such a bigger market, a vastly bigger market, and because there's so many commuters, so many people in their cars that are a captive audience for podcasts. So, but I think, you know, places like Audible recognized that, you know, the UK shares a common language with the US. English has become kind of the lingua franca, you know, around the world. And so they saw the wisdom in investing in this market because, you know, it travels very easily.
Now I have two questions for you. The first one is, do you have the rights to adapt Radio Man to other languages and market, or that depends on Audible?
I do have the right. Yeah, Audible benefits from my exploitation of it, but I do have the right to do that. Yes. So let me know if you want to do it.
Do you have writers to adapt it?
Do you need a producer?
You guys have plenty of great writers. You just come to me. Somebody who wants to do it. I'm very happy to have the conversation.
And my second,
Zico, don't forget me, Zico, on this.
Yeah, you're in. You're in.
And my second question is, you have a lot of shows that have already ended in your production company, like Hunted. Have you thought of making maybe a second season through podcasts or something like that, now that you ventured into this world?
I would love to do that. Like on an emotional level and creative level, I would love to do that. On a practical level, no. Just because I am so busy making new television shows.
I know.
I don't have time to revisit my older television shows. And I have to say, you know, there are more stories I want to tell than I will have time in my life to tell. I know that. You know, I have a limited amount of time and ability, and I would love to look back, but I don't have that luxury right now.
Perfect. And one final question. What's your favorite podcast right now?
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you give us some tips of what you're listening to lately.
Wow. You know what I'm listening to? It's not strictly a podcast, but it could have been. I mentioned the filmmaker David Lynch earlier.
Yeah.
And he's just done an audiobook. And it's his biography. But what's so fascinating about it is that one chapter is a standard biography written by a biographer telling you about David Lynch. And then the next several chapters are just him talking. That's why I say it could be a podcast, because it's him just telling, and he's telling you all kinds of stories about his life that would never make it into a biography. They're just texture, you know, what his grandmother was like, or, you know, the firecrackers he set off in his neighborhood, or, you know, what it was like, you know, being with his parents or something. But it is so revealing and intimate and recovers this lost world. Like I said, it's not strictly a podcast, but it's on. Yeah, I'm listening to it on Audible. It could be a podcast, and it's enchanting. So I'm absolutely loving that right now. And then there's this Pushkin Industries, which does this wonderful revisionist history podcast with Malcolm Gladwell. They have one coming out in a few weeks, which is a wonderful writer for the New Yorker magazine named Adam Gopnik, talking to Steve Martin, the comedian, and that I'm waiting for very excitedly. I'm not listening to any scripted podcasts at the moment, so I can't give you any referrals there.
Perfect. But those are great tips. And one final question, another final question. Are you looking for any types of podcasts in the market, or no, you're just too busy for it right now?
No, I mean, at the moment, we still have this exclusive deal with Vespucci. So we're just looking at journalism that they've collected from around the world for our next podcast. But they have hundreds and hundreds of stories, so we're always getting new things submitted to us. But no, it's wide open. I know for me personally, as a storyteller, as a producer, I'm always looking for, why do I want to tell this story? Why, among the endless stories out there, there's thousands of stories, why is this one worth my time and worth the audience's time? And why does this have the potential to be not just good, but why is this going to be a really, really great story and worth the thousands of hours of my life I'm about to devote to it? That is the way you need to look at this. It's like, you can't do everything. So why are you doing this? Why is this going to be great? And as I said before, like, I always try just to aim as high as I possibly can. So some of my favorite filmmakers, I feel like sometimes later in their careers, they stop aiming as high as they did when they were young. If some of these filmmakers, when they're young, it feels like they're out to conquer the world. And then after a while, it feels like they settle into like a level that they're comfortable operating at. And I've always felt like I never want to be that guy. I never want to get comfortable. I always want to, reach as high as I can.
Amazing.
This is one of the greatest tips for everybody. Get out of your comfort zone. Don't accommodate. Yeah. Be, you have to be more active, and you have to feel the pain of the creation, right? Because it's painful, right? It's
painful. To this day, every time out, and I'm not faking it, and I'm not kidding you. Every time out, there is terror when I'm writing a script. There comes a point in every script I write where I am really, truly unhappy. You can ask my wife. It's just part of the process. I think psychologically somehow you need to get to that place in yourself to make sure you're pushing yourself as hard as you can. But I teach young writers, people in their early 20s who are out to conquer the world. I've been doing this, longer than they've been alive. And I need to be as driven and determined and ambitious as they are. You can't relax, you can't sit back, you've got to lean forward and give it your best every day. And if you do, you will get that reward back. But it's when you sit back, when you stop leaning forward, that actually it kind of is a slow death of your creative soul.
Yeah.
It kind of starts to sap your energy and your excitement for what you're doing. So it's just about, staying hungry.
Yeah,
always.
Stay hungry. Yeah, avoid the end of the story. I feel Luza feels the same as a writer, and a very preeminent and awarded writer.
I want to try new things all the time. I want to try new things. I don't want to be controlled that much by the channels. So I need to be the owner of my intentions, of my objectives. I want to drive things according to my wishes, not according to somebody else's wishes. But I think the most important thing that Frank has said to us today is stay hungry.
Yeah, stay hungry.
The most important thing. If someday another media comes up and offers itself as an opportunity to us, we need to stay hungry and need to adapt ourselves. We need to learn the rules, the policies, the guides we need to study in order to develop and deliver good content. Because I agree with Frank, everybody wants, and there is no better time in history for us to be a writer right now. I understand that here in Brazil there are some problems in order to we are dealing with different players that we are not used to. But the key to the success is stay hungry. That's the most important thing that I've heard today. Thank you for that, Frank.
Thank you,
Frank. I have a sort of another final question, because
many final questions.
You said that Audible didn't interfere much, like in the notes that they sent. And you also said that you didn't have any benchmark when scripting Radio Man. Do you think that the players in the audio streaming realm do they have a lighter approach to the creation? Like they are not so heavy, like the audio visual players are towards directors and writers. Do you think this is happening? They have this lighter approach, and should that lighter approach be due to what you just said, that there's no benchmark? Maybe there's not a formula, as saying that assuming that this is a new market. Nobody knows it 100%, not even the players. So they rely on the creativity of guys like you. For instance.
Well, I can't pretend to be that much of an expert, having only made 3 podcasts, but my impression from experience of these 3 podcasts is that just because of the nature of podcast production, it is less collaborative. There's just fewer people involved in the decision-making process than there is in television, and it happens in a shorter time span than television does. So there's probably fewer opportunities to interfere, right? It's, there's just fewer people to talk to, and it's happening a lot faster, and the budgets are smaller. But I do think, there's some really, really big players now in the podcast world. Audible is one. Wondery, Pushkin Industries. There's a number of really, really big podcast companies, and I think they take it very, very seriously. So I think their standards are quite high. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They're not going to interfere if something is good. And I think they recognized Radio Man's quality, and that's why they had really very few notes at all.
Alone. Yeah, good to know. Okay, I think we are heading to the end.
Any final questions?
No, I'm just I'm really excited to talk to you about podcasts, and I really do hope this has been useful to all of you, and it leads to something.
Very, very useful for sure, Frank. Thank you again for agreeing to do this, and on behalf of Zico and Lusa, thank you for being with us. And
thank you.
And obrigado por todo mundo que esteve aqui hoje com a gente.
Obrigado.
Amanhã
thank you, everybody.
Amanhã estaremos de volta com mais um seminário às 10h30 da manhã. Se alguém não recebeu o link, pode me escrever. Vocês têm meu e-mail. Eu vou deixar aqui também no chat para qualquer contato. E nos vemos amanhã de manhã, então. Obrigado a todo mundo. Zico, Lusa, obrigado.
Obrigado a todos. Frank, again, thank you again.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
Thank
you very much.
Bye-bye. Nice talking to you, Frank. I hope it happens again.
Thank you. See you in Brazil.
Okay. See you soon in Brazil.
Bye-bye. Zico e Thiago, obrigado pelo convite. Um beijo para todo mundo. Escrevam e mandem para a gente, para o Zico, principalmente.
Essa foi boa.